Welcome to this live video stream from the British Academy for the Humanities and Social Sciences. The event will start at 6 p.m. GMT. Thank you for your patience. this live video stream from the British Academy for the Humanities and Social Sciences. The event will start at 6 p.m. GMT. Thank you for your patience. British Academy for the Humanities and Social Sciences welcomes you to this online event, which comes to you live from the British Academy in London. This evening we will hear from leading Keynes biographer Lord Skidelsky and Permanent Secretary to the Treasury Nick Macpherson as they debate whether Keynes's General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money still has a place 80 years after it was first published, or if Keynesian thought remains in a state of political and theoretical decline. Further details about this evening's event are available at britac.ac.uk. The audience are currently taking their seats, so we will join them live at the British Academy very shortly.
You go nearest. Oh, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the British Academy. My name is Alan Evans, and I'm Chief Executive here. The British Academy exists to promote and celebrate the importance of all aspects of the social sciences and humanity in our life and culture today. And today's event is a celebration of one of the great scholars of the past century, John Maynard Keynes, Fellow of the British Academy. Keynes was, of course, an economist, but famously one who never took an exam in economics. Studied mathematics, classics, and history at Cambridge, so he spanned all the sciences, humanities, and social sciences. And today we're celebrating 80 years since the publication in February 1936 of arguably his greatest book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. Before I introduce our two speakers, I just want to say very briefly a word about Keynes and the British Academy, because it's actually a fascinating story, and I'll tell it very briefly. But Keynes was first proposed for fellowship of the Academy in 1919 at the age of only 36. And nowadays, the average age of election to the Academy is 57. So they were clearly ahead of their time there in terms of tackling ageism against the young. Anyway, he was proposed in 1919, but was blackballed from election on the grounds that his book, The Economic Consequences of this Peace, was seen as too pro-German and anti-French. So Keynes refused to let his name go forward for election for a decade, but he finally relented and was appointed a fellow in 1929. He became very active in the Academy. Indeed, he promoted Beatrice Webb's candidacy as the first woman fellow of the Academy, and he went on to be chair of economics. And later, things came full circle in 1946 when he was proposed as president of the Academy, a quarter of a century after having been blackballed, but he died before he could take office. So Keynes and the British Academy is quite a story in history. Anyway, tonight's celebration is about his most famous economic work, and I'm absolutely delighted we've got two magnificent speakers. Robert Skidelsky, Lord Skidelsky, will speak first on the general theory at 80, why it matters then and why it still matters today. Lord Skidelsky is Fellow of the British Academy and author of magnificent 3-volume biography of Keynes. And next, Sir Nicholas Macpherson, Permanent Secretary of the Treasury, will speak on Keynes and policymaking in the Treasury today. Nick is Permanent Secretary and has been for over 10 years and now has, I think, 8 weeks left as Permanent Secretary. He's worked for Ken Clarke and Gordon Brown as Principal Private Secretary, for Gordon Brown, Alistair Darling, and George Osborne as a Permanent Secretary. So he just goes to prove he's one of the great civil servants who can work with politicians of all sizes, shapes, colours, and hues, and get on well with all of them. Each of our speakers will speak for 15 or 20 minutes. I may ask one or two questions, but then we'll open up for questions and debate. So thank you all very much for coming, and I'd like to ask Robert Skidelsky, Lord Skidelsky, Fellow of the British Academy, to speak first. Robert.
In 1935, Keynes wrote to Bernard Shaw, "I'm writing a book of theory which, I quote, will largely revolutionize the way we think about economic problems." He also famously wrote, "In the long run, we're all dead." And I just want to juxtapose these two statements and consider what parts of Keynes live 80 years after the publication of the General Theory. As with all interesting questions, there's no simple answer. Two aspects of his theoretical legacy seem secure. First, Keynes invented macroeconomics, the theory of output as a whole. The simple aggregate equations of Keynesian economics are still taught in the textbooks and frame macroeconomic forecasting and policy. This analytical framework just wasn't available before the Keynesian revolution. Second, it is accepted, still accepted, that depressions can and should be prevented. Witness the policy response to the collapse of 2008-2009, very different from the reaction to the Great Depression of 1929-1932. As Robert Lucas, certainly not a great fan of Keynes, put it, I guess everyone is a Keynesian in the foxhole. Keynes's bequest to political economy also endures, and I'd just like to single out a few of these features. His analysis of slumps in terms of deficient demand demolished competing analyses of slumps, the Marxist class struggle being the most prominent casualty. The Keynesian full employment commitment of the 1950s and 1960s played a central role in saving capitalism from state socialism and communism. The Bretton Woods system, which Keynes helped set up, helped dampen the historical business cycle for 25 years, giving capitalist economies the longest period of uninterrupted growth in history. And finally, Keynesianism was one of the forces bringing about a larger, more constructive state, though not the only one. Having said that, we must acknowledge that Keynes's own theory of output as a whole is no longer accepted by most economists and policy makers. To put it shortly, Keynes's general theory is no longer believed to be general. The title of his magnum opus was intended to pinpoint the logical possibility of multiple equilibria, with the classical full employment position as a special case. Keynes's own view was that the typical or average situation of an unmanaged capitalist economy was one of, I quote, underemployment equilibrium. This visionary side of Keynes's resolution faltered from the start. It ran up against what James Tobin called the theoretical paradigm central to our discipline, that of general competitive equilibrium in which rational individuals optimize and markets for all commodities are simultaneously cleared. So most economists came to think of Keynesian economics as depression economics, with full employment as the general or normal case, and underemployment as the exceptional or special case, a complete reversal of Keynes's own vision. And that is more or less, the mainstream view today. And the collapse of autumn 2008 really bears this out. While discrediting the wild versions of the optimally self-adjusting economy, the collapse did not restore the prestige of Keynesian economics. I wrote a book in 2009 called The Return of the Master, and one reviewer pointed out that the master had returned for just 6 months. Paradoxically, it was the very success of Keynesian measures in halting the downward slide of the global economy which salvaged pre-crash orthodoxy. For the price of success was to saddle governments with greatly enlarged deficits and rising debts. Lacking a Keynesian rationale for expansionary policies to restore full employment, the deterioration in the balance sheet of most governments alarmed the bond markets, which in effect forced a reversal of the policy. Keynes's warning that economies might remain trapped in inferior equilibria was no longer part of the common understanding. Keynes was strictly for the short run, and a very short run. Now, it's important, this, even though one might think of it as semantics, this sort of distinction between, the general and the particular, and what is the normal case, because which state of affairs one regards as normal makes a great difference to the policies which one thinks are appropriate. In Keynes's vision, it was the instability of investment due to inescapable uncertainty which caused economies to falter. Hence, the thrust of Keynesian policy was to enlarge government spending. He famously looked forward to the socialization of investment. In contrast, the subsequently new classical economics, reverted to John Stuart Mill's dictum that economies, I quote, only misbehave if money misbehaves. The misbehavior of money causes people to confuse money prices and real prices. And from this point of view, the main object of macroeconomic policy is to keep not investment stable, but prices stable. Given that mass unemployment was the main problem of the interwar years, it's not surprising that Keynesian governments of the 1950s and 1960s made full employment their main goal. In Britain, we may forget, this was defined as 2% unemployment or less. And that was achieved over 20 years. We will consider in a moment whether this achievement was specifically Keynesian. There's a big argument about this, but I just want to make one point now, and that is that historically, boom periods have always been followed by busts. It didn't need Milton Friedman to point out that prolonged booms would lead to rising prices. Most Keynesians, especially in Britain, rejected the Phillips curve trade-off between inflation and unemployment, which implied that there was an employment cost to be paid for keeping prices stable, a cost that would grow the longer the boom lasted. For British Keynesians, most of them, ultra-low unemployment, because it had become a theoretical possibility, had also become a political imperative. And their solution to inflation was cost control through incomes policy. Incomes policy was tried in many countries from the 1960s through to the end of the 1970s. At best, there were temporary successes, but the policies always broke down. The reason, pointed out by Friedman in 1968 and taken up by politicians like Keith Joseph, was that inflation resulted from the full employment commitment itself, from attempts by Keynesian governments to force down unemployment below its natural rate. And the key to stable prices, therefore, was to abandon the full employment commitment and emasculate the trade unions. And that was done under Margaret Thatcher and to some extent under Ronald Reagan in the United States. The full employment target was replaced by the inflation target, and unemployment was left to settle at its natural rate, whatever that might be. And that is still the orthodoxy. Now, I know there are you can put lots of qualifications in that, but that is still basically what happened till the crash. Now, I come back to the subject of what caused the golden age of the 1950s and 1960s, to be so golden for the world economy. Unemployment was very low, fluctuations in output very small, growth continuous, inflation moderate. And the performance at the time was considered to be a vindication of Keynesian economics. The current view is that the Golden Age had very little to do with the use of Keynesian tools. This was pointed out as early as 1968 in a well-known article by Robin Matthews, that there was simply a great world boom, and given opportunities for technological catch-up and recession-proof military spending in the United States, it would have happened even if Keynes had never lived. That's not quite right, actually, in my view. I think you've got to take account of a number of features. First of all, the Bretton Woods system introduced a very, very different kind of international payment system than the gold standard. Secondly, there were the expectations that government would allow unemployment to fall. And so I think those two things in conjunction with other factors, prolonged the boom more than it would have lasted in a pre-Keynesian era, but at the expense of an accumulation of problems. Having rejected a Keynesian explanation of the mid-century boom, the current wisdom, nevertheless, attributes the great moderation of the years 1995 to 2008 to another set of policies, that is, inflation targeting. But how far was the low inflation of this period due to monetary policy? And how far was it due to the fact that we had a benign environment with the China price keeping down the global price level? Then we had the unexpected collapse of 2008. Was this endogenously generated by the financial system, or was it somehow the result of government failure, over-regulation, inattention to asset price inflation? And now we can surely expect a prolonged period of incomplete recovery and turbulence to go with it. Specifically, investment, the key driver in Keynesian economics, has not reverted to its pre-crash level, with little happening to revive the animal spirits of entrepreneurs. A comparison of these episodes suggests to me that the attempt to develop a general theory to cover all cases is a delusion. General theories are empty boxes which are necessarily filled up with the particular conditions of the time. These will require different treatments. The ambitions of economists should be limited to providing, they've been called this before, horses for courses theories based on the stylized facts of time and place. It is the logical extremism of economics which sets up these binary divisions between Keynesians and anti-Keynesians, between normal and abnormal. Let me conclude with two reflections. And these suggest a renewed, if more modest, role for Keynesian economics as part of a wider revival of radicalism. The collapse of 2008 was undoubtedly a huge blow to the self-confidence of the Chicago school. But perhaps an even bigger shock was the revelation of the extent to which post-crash governments had allowed their policies to be scripted by the bankers, whose anticipated adverse reaction to deficits trapped governments in austerity at the wrong time. To control financial markets in the interests of full employment and social justice lies squarely in the Keynesian tradition, though it is part of other radical traditions as well. And the second way in which I think Keynes will continue to live is, as in his own time, for the younger generation. For the new generation of students, Keynes's relevance may be seen to lie less in his specific remedies for unemployment than in his view of how to do economics. He criticized his profession for modeling on the basis of unreal assumptions, such as the one he particularly selected, the barter economy, in which money was, or always could be, kept neutral. Real values, Keynes said, were always hopelessly entangled with monetary factors, and that's what rendered economies unstable. Many students are eager to escape from the skeletal world of optimizing agents with given preferences to one of fully rounded humans set in their histories, cultures, and institutions and interacting with each other. Keynes's economics was inherently sympathetic to this quest, and that's why I expect him still to be a living presence 20 years hence on the centenary of the General Theory.
Nick.
Thank you very much. Well, that's an extremely hard act to follow. In my view, Keynes was the greatest British thinker of the 20th century. He had an extraordinary mind. He was a brilliant polemicist. And I'm proud that he served in Her Majesty's Treasury, whose view I shall seek to represent here tonight. But 80 years on from the general theory, he remains elusive, partly because he was a creature of his time, which ties in with Lord Skidelsky's comments. That is the chronic under-demand of the interwar years, and partly because his ideas were continually evolving. Keynes was and is a paradox. A liberal who proposed protection, a capitalist who regarded most business people with contempt, a conscientious objector who worked round the clock in support of the war effort. The general theory is a masterpiece. It put macroeconomic analysis and policy firmly on the map. It provides huge insights into expectations, uncertainty, and the operation of markets. His description of the stock market in chapter 12 should be compulsory reading for economists and investors alike. And since my grandfather was his stockbroker, I have some first-hand primary source evidence of that. It also provided much, though not all, of the basis for what came to be known as Keynesianism, a view that government could not just manage demand, but seek to smooth the operation of the trade cycle through fiscal policy. Whether Keynes himself would have supported such an approach had he lived, we will never know. The general theory was focused on addressing persistent depression. Chapter 22, Notes on the Trade Cycle, is almost an afterthought. It was Hicks, Mead, and others who sought to operationalise Keynesianism. You'll be relieved to hear that now is not the time to set out a defence of the much maligned Treasury view of the 1920s and 1930s, but I would merely make 2 points. First, the Treasury view evolved over time. As George Peden has shown, it was much more nuanced than some of its critics have claimed. And secondly, its focus on monetary policy as a way of regulating the economy set out in Ralph Hawtrey's seminal Economica article of 1925 is still relevant today. The Treasury policy of loose monetary policy and tight fiscal policy after the UK came off the gold standard in 1931 proved highly effective. Similarly, in recent years, the speed of the authorities' interventions on monetary and credit policy have been instrumental in the UK's recovery. And so the question I'd like to address tonight is whether beyond the initial loosening and tightening of fiscal policy by the then Chancellor Alistair Darling in 2008-9, the Treasury should have made more use of Keynesian policies in recent years. I'll set out 9 reasons why the Treasury remains cautious, if not sceptical, about an activist fiscal policy. For completeness, I should make clear that many of the arguments apply equally to using monetary policy as a tune for fine-tuning. The Treasury has always been sceptical about crude monetarism, as it has about naive Keynesianism. First, the labour market is much more efficient than it was in the interwar period. Policy since the 1980s has focused on reforming industrial relations, improving work incentives, and pursuing more active welfare-to-work policies. Just as unemployment peaked at a lower level in the 1990s recession, so did it again in the 2009 recession, with unprecedented real wage adjustment facilitating the maintenance of employment. Keynes' case for public works in the 1930s rested on his view that nominal and hence real wages could not adjust, not least because of the strength of the trades union movement. Secondly, over my working life, there's been a persistent tendency to mistake structural weakness for cyclical weakness. Keynes was writing at a time of chronically low demand, but it's not at all clear that recent experience fits this description. Apart from a brief hiatus in 2011 caused by the Eurozone crisis, unemployment has been falling persistently since the beginning of 2010. In the last 3 years, it's fallen by over a third, while the rate of employment in the UK has reached a record high. Throughout this period, until input prices began to plummet in 2014, core consumer price inflation remained above its pre-crisis average and did not fall below 2% on a sustained basis until September 2014. Neither of these indicators are obvious signs of chronic lack of demand, and I doubt Keynes would have seen them as such. While the evidence is building that the growth of productive potential in the UK and the US has slowed significantly since the financial crisis. But throughout this period, the Keynesian prescription has been the same: more stimulus and a higher deficit. That naturally leads me on to my third argument, the issue of asymmetry. For most of the post-war period, governments find it much easier to lower interest rates than to increase them, and to relax fiscal policy than to tighten it. No wonder there's a tendency for inflation always to be a little higher than desirable, and for deficits to predominate at the expense of surpluses. Now, Gordon Brown dealt with the former through making the Bank of England operationally independent in 1997. In a democracy, it's difficult to see how fiscal policy could be contracted to an independent body. However, successive governments have sought to address this tendency through elaborate fiscal rules, and more recently through George Osborne's creation of an independent office for budgetary responsibility chaired by Robert Choate, who's here tonight. Fourthly, Keynesian demand management is likely to be much more effective in a relatively closed economy like the United States than an open economy like the UK. Here, demand expansion has historically fed through into imports and the current account. As Mark Carney recently pointed out, you cannot always rely on the kindness of strangers to help solve balance of payment problems. That led Keynes to argue for protection in the 1930s, just as Wynne Godley and the New Cambridge School argued for import controls in the 1970s. The Treasury has consistently set a very high bar when considering protection. Its commitment to free trade dates back to Gladstone, and you only have to look at the famous Kindleberger spiderweb diagram to see the damage protection did to the world economy in the 1930s. Fifthly, the mythical shovel-ready infrastructure project is precisely that, a myth. This is nothing new. The Treasury made the same point in the 1930s. But it is more of a problem today given the inexorable growth in planning law and wider regulation. Keynes' suggestion in Chapter 10 of the General Theory that the Treasury fill old bottles with banknotes, bury them in disused coal mines, which are then filled up the surface with town rubbish, and leave it to private enterprise to dig up, would be the victim of many a health and safety regulation and environmental impact assessment today. In short, the lead times for getting public investment up and running are long and variable. That leads some latter-day Keynesians to advocate short-term tax changes. Here, there tends to be administrative lags. For example, a change in the national insurance rate takes 6 months. That takes you inexorably to changes in VAT, which Alistair Darling reduced on a temporary basis in November 2008. That did bring forward expenditure, albeit some cost. An alternative is to increase current spending, but the problem there is that you can only do that by increasing entitlements or employment or wages. Such changes are notoriously difficult to reverse. Sixthly, there are the economic costs to businesses and individuals of continually changing tax rates and spending programs. Businesses and consumers want a stable tax system. It enables them to plan with certainty. Tax policy is best set in a medium-term framework, as, for example, the current Chancellor has been seeking to do with the corporate tax regime. The move to multi-year spending reviews from 1998 onwards also reflected the view of successive Chancellors that public service managers can spend money more efficiently if there is budget certainty over the medium term. Seventhly, Ricardian equivalence is also relevant to fiscal policy's effectiveness. A permanent stimulus will lead consumers to conclude that it will have to be financed, neutralising much of its impact. A theoretical case can be made that any Ricardian offset will be smaller if consumers know that the stimulus is temporary. Nevertheless, they're still likely to look through the change to some degree, reducing any intertemporal effect. Whether for Ricardian reasons or because of wider leakages to imports, the Office for Budgetary Responsibility has estimated the fiscal multiplier at less than 1. And interestingly, Nick Crafts has estimated that fiscal interventions in the early 1930s would not have paid for themselves. The role of the multiplier takes me to my 8th argument, the sheer magnitude of the fiscal interventions that would be necessary to stabilise the economy. This can best be illustrated either by looking at the extent to which the private sector savings ratio varies year by year, or by the extent to which output diverges from trend. The latter is much easier to estimate ex post than ex ante, but on the face of it, output has diverged from trend by up to 4% of GDP since 1990 in any 1 year. Using OBR estimates of the multiplier, stabilizing the output gap would have required at times interventions of the scale of 100 to 250 billion pounds compared to a neutral stance. And even if a limit was placed on discretionary counter-cyclical interventions of, say, 1% of GDP in any 1 year, there would still be regular changes in policy of up to 18 billion pounds a year. Whether or not that would unsettle a market, it would certainly trigger the damaging effects on economic efficiency I mentioned earlier. Finally, I'd like to argue that there are positive benefits as well as costs to the trade cycle, providing it can be kept within reasonable limits. As Nigel Lawson has said, the superiority of market capitalism lies in particular in two areas: the freedom and encouragement it gives to innovation and risk-taking, and the discipline that drives up efficiency and drives down costs. The former is stimulated most during the cyclical upswing, and the latter is compelled most during the downswing. It is at least arguable that if economies moved in a straight line rather than in cyclical patterns, there might in the long run be less of both these benefits. In short, Schumpeter may still have as much relevance today as Keynes. The Treasury may be sceptical about activist demand management, but that does not mean it abdicates responsibility for economic performance. As a nation's economics ministry, it attaches a high weight to microeconomic policies that promote growth, productivity, and employment. Since the 1970s, successive chancellors have sought to create a macroeconomic framework which seeks to create price stability. For the most part, the Treasury has relied on monetary policy to achieve that objective. Since 1997, an operationally independent Bank of England has been tasked with hitting a symmetric inflation target. Fiscal policy has generally played a subsidiary role, with chancellors setting it to achieve a medium-term objective, a surplus under Nigel Lawson and George Osborne, a current surplus under Gordon Brown, underpinned with a target for the national debt. That does not mean there is no role for fiscal policy. In the recent downturn, the automatic stabilizers played an important role in supporting demand. As George Osborne has said, by not chasing the debt target, we allowed the automatic stabilizers to operate, and that is a sensible economic decision that supports the economy in that sense during a cyclical downturn. And as a pragmatic institution, the Treasury would never rule out recommending a fiscal response if the conditions were right. But it is no surprise to me that the response to the recent crisis has focused on monetary policy and the credit channel rather than on fiscal policy. In 2008, we saw the advent of the special liquidity scheme, the credit guarantee scheme, and quantitative easing. Latterly, we've seen the funding for lending scheme supplemented by other interventions, such as Help to Buy, all of which have been designed to reduce the gap between official interest rates and the rates companies and households pay. If you have a banking crisis followed by a credit crunch, you need to treat the disease rather than the symptom. Similarly, it's the nature of a banking crisis that government deficits are likely to rise, often sharply. That is not a time to take risks with the deficit. There are always inflection points when just a little extra borrowing can do untold damage to how you are perceived in the markets. Yields start to rise, debt servicing costs begin to spiral, and that risk increases if you go into a downturn with an already high debt level. Some neo-Keynesians may write off the modern Treasury view as expounded by practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence, but are usually the slaves of some defunct economist or madmen in authority who hear voices in the air and are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. But I'd like to think that Maynard Keynes, who understood markets as well as anybody, would have approved of what the Treasury has done since 2008. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Robert and Nick for two really stimulating talks and lots of ideas there. If I could just ask a couple of questions from the chair and then open it up. when I studied economics a long time ago, before Thatcherism and monetarism was great vogue, everyone talked about demand management and the multiplier effect and how valuable that was. Nick's speech implied it had no effect at all. But Robert, do you think the multiplier effect ever worked effectively, or was it always a myth?
No, no, it wasn't always a myth. I think, of course, there's always been debate about how large the multiplier is at any particular time. And it may be that the Treasury is right, that the multiplier at the moment is very small. But I would argue that's because so much productive capacity has been destroyed. So, the economy may be working close to its production frontier, but in fact, it's receded. And there's also another point. The IMF and other international organizations have recently said that they consistently underestimated the multiplier earlier on in the crisis. And one has to ask why that was so. And I think the reason basically was they had wrong model of the economy. I mean, if you believe that there's always a very, very strong natural tendency towards full employment, and that, this operates quite quickly, then of course you're going to get a lower estimate of a positive multiplier than if you don't. So that's the way I would answer it. But it's a tricky concept. I mean, there are lots of things, that are very difficult to estimate accurately. Where you are at any point in time, particularly.
Just to make clear, if anybody thinks I'm a dinosaur, I didn't say the multiplier had no effect. I just said that an increase in government spending wouldn't pay for itself, which some rather optimistic so-called Keynesians sometimes argue.
Yeah. Keynes didn't believe it would pay for itself directly, but he believed that if if the economy was expanded as a result of it, of course, you would get an increase in revenue.
Let me ask just one more question to you, Nick, then open it up. One of the tasks of a permanent secretary, as you know, one of the interesting tasks is in the run-up to an election is to meet the opposite numbers from the opposition parties. Any advice you'd like to give to your successor when he or she has to meet Mr. MacDonald, who might be potential Chancellor Exchequer, in terms of the values of fiscal stimulus and even if it means higher inflation?
Well, I'm told by friends of Mr. MacDonald that he did an excellent job managing the finances of the GLC back in the early 80s. So I have, he's clearly a serious man. I mean, my experience of politicians generally is actually economic debate takes place in a very narrow channel. It's always about sort of 10 to 20 billion. Now, it may be that the current Labour Party will adopt a rather more advanced position, rather like the Mitterrand government did in 1981. I think it'll be a very good conversation. I'm only sad I won't be doing it, but to be doing it, I'd have had to stay for 15 years, and I think, that's just, far too long.
You can comment from the sidelines.
Even though Warren Fisher did it for 20 years between the wars, I think we look back at Warren Fisher and we don't think that highly of him.
There aren't many permanent secretaries who stay for over 10 years, so you've done very well. Let us take some questions from the floor. Lord Stern, Nick.
Thank you very much, and I'm very sorry I couldn't be there at the beginning. I came from Oxford from a meeting which had a random ending, which I couldn't forecast, which is really the point of my question. And it's really to Robert, and thank you both very much for the very thoughtful ideas you put across. And it's really a remark on the greatness and the generality of Keynes. I never met him. He died the day before I was born, but I listened carefully as a young student to Richard Kahn, Joan Robinson, and Nicky Caldor as a student. So I got my Keynes from them, as it were. And I always felt they made a terrible mistake in coupling their teaching of Keynes with great rants about Arrow de Breu and their formalization of Walrasian equilibria. Because essentially, what Keynes is doing is talking about the general case, and this is the sense, an important sense of generality, the general case, which is one where all the markets which are assumed in a narrow de Broglie, or the generalization of the Valrasian equilibrium, he's assuming that those markets don't exist. And it's a very peculiar case, and indeed it's a vacuous case, it doesn't happen, that all those futures markets for all kinds of commodities in every contingent circumstances at every date in the future, that they exist. So it's the failure of that arrow de Broglie world. When Jim Tobin said all markets clear, it's all markets is a big question. Which markets? Well, most of the markets don't exist, so if they don't exist, they won't clear. If they had said, the Robinson and Kahn and Kaldor and so on, that what Keynes did was to take a world which goes beyond that hugely simplistic case, which has been written down now in a very clear and formal way, which allows us to see what's going on by arrow de Broglie. If it said that the great Keynes actually anticipated in many ways he did all that, and was writing about a world where those futures markets don't exist, and the contingent markets don't exist. In that case, expectations become absolutely fundamental, yeah, in determining aggregate demand. So it's his concept of expectations, and expectations rooted in the absence of all these future markets, together with the concept of aggregate demand, which was a new concept, aggregate demand. Those together, I think, support what Keynes said in his letter, that he was writing a general theory, general relative to the perfect market equilibrium, and that it would change the way in which we understand things, because aggregate demand and expectations have to move to the absolute heart of the stage. And in that, and then of course, once you've got aggregate demand, you can talk not only about investment, but the other bits of aggregate demand and what different kinds of policy can do to those. So it seems to me that we've lost his greatness by running it back to whether multipliers are big or small, and that's not the deeper fundamental conceptual framework in which Keynes was speaking. He was speaking about a general theory, and general, I think, in the crucial senses that I've just described. So I think the celebration of Keynes should focus much more on those things rather than the particularities of a multiplier.
Yeah, I mean, could I just briefly respond? I mean, I agree with that, and that's why I sort of really pitched my remarks at the point of Keynes's vision of the economy, his broader concept of how economies worked. I mean, the point I wanted to make, essentially, and I mean, all that seems to me to be highly interesting and relevant, was that is no longer generally believed. I mean, in a way, what I quoted from James Tobin, which was, of course, the arrow de Broglie kind of view of things, that markets normally do clear, that expectations normally are such that they do clear, is much more widely accepted than the Keynesian view, that you can get such expectations lasting for such a period of time that economies remain permanently depressed or semi-permanently depressed. I don't think the mainstream has believed that. What? Yeah, well, that's all right. I mean, I'm not defending this view. What I'm saying, I'm not defending neoclassical economics. I'm just saying, I'm just trying to, I think, sum up what a lot of the mainstream profession do now believe, or have believed. So I'm trying to describe a state of affairs within the economics profession. And now I've simplified it, of course, but I still think that divide between what you think of as general and what you think of as special or particular is an important point to discuss, and I think that is the debate you've just opened.
Questions? Bill, could you say who you are? So people know.
William Keegan, the Observer, and the Keynes Policy Group. I'd like to ask, I was interested in Nick's view that Keynes will have approved of Treasury policy since 2010. As he knows, I disagree with that. I'd love to hear Robert on that subject.
You what?
I'd love to hear you on the subject. Would Keynes have agreed with Treasury policy since 2010?
No, of course not. I mean, in fact,
since the financial crisis.
Yeah, you did. Well, okay.
Yeah. I mean, you know, in fact,
Since the financial crisis. I'll happily rephrase that.
the debate between Keynes and Sir Richard Hopkins before the Macmillan Committee in 1930. And Keynes said about the Treasury view, after he had heard, you know, he had had this great tussle with Hopkins, and the chairman said, I think we can call it a draw, because Hopkins was very clever. And Keynes said, the Treasury view bends so much, I find it hard to grasp it. And of course, what the Treasury did was exactly, I mean, it's very similar to what Nick did. I mean, Keynes started off believing that the Treasury had some sort of Ricardian equivalence view of things. And the Treasury said, no, we wouldn't go as far as that. And so as the debate developed, Hopkins introduced expectations. He said, look, if the effect of what you're suggesting is adverse on expectations, surely then any positive effects will be swamped by the flight of money from the country, or people deciding that this wasn't a good place to spend their money in now. And Keynes then said, do you mean to say that are you denying that a certain amount of expenditure would cure unemployment? And Hopkins said, do you want me to agree with that? Do you want me to deny that? I wouldn't deny it. It all depends on the atmosphere in which these schemes are sort of implemented. And if people don't believe that they'll do any good, they won't do any good. And that is one of the big debates, has been one of the big debates about fiscal policy since 2010. Incidentally, on Ricardian equivalence, Ricardo never believed it, of course, in Ricardian equivalence. He thought it was an interesting theoretical speculation. He thought there was a lot of myopia. Now, that seemed to me a quite realistic view. And the idea that people anticipate the exact amount of extra taxes they'll have to pay because, measure it against what the government is borrowing seems to be absolute rubbish. There may be some, but Ricardian effects, but it was Barrow who really produced the full Ricardian theory as it is explained today. And I know I took part in debates on this in our house, the House of Lords, and ministers got up and said, well, Ricardian equivalence, we've got to think about that. Borrowing is only deferred taxation. That's it. And so, I think your modern Treasury, but very clever, very, very, and as Keynes said, I find it hard to grasp the Treasury view.
Defend the Treasury, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to I feel I'm now going to start rerunning the debates of the 20s and 30s. I was seeking really just to set out why the Treasury is cautious. I mean, as an institution, I think Treasury's got to be cautious because someone's got to be, because all the pressure is always to spend more and tax less. So I'm not a pure Ricardian, and I don't think the Treasury is a pure Ricardian. The issue is, is there something in Ricardian equivalence? And I would say yes. And Hopkins' point about, about the quality of the schemes, I think is a valid one. There have been various points in time when I can recall sort of politicians coming up with ideas for announcements where you really do worry whether they would be counterproductive with, consumers thinking, God, if they're doing that, things must be really bad, and then saving even more. So, I think Keynes made many valid criticisms, and it may be that the Treasury is difficult to pin down. Keynes actually, I think, was quite difficult to pin down. But I mean, just briefly to come back to the next point, I do think, where Keynes was really relevant in the crisis, I thought, was around the issue of uncertainty, where you cannot reduce uncertainty to mathematical models. And that also ties in where I agree very much with you. I think there's food for thought about how economics is taught and the role of sort of human psychology, market psychology, which cannot be reduced to some sort of Goldman Sachs model, which I remember there's some extraordinary stat where, according to some model, what had just taken place, that was a 1 in a billion chance, when actually financial crises of the sort we've experienced then happen every 100 years or so, and you get minor ones every 10 years or so. Sorry, I digressed.
There's a question somewhere over here. Was there someone? In the front there, yeah. There, at the front and then afterwards.
Thanks. Barry Buzan, LSE. The title of this panel is From Keynes to Corbynomics. So presumably whoever wrote that thought there was some line of connection between those two things.
Well,
is there?
Don't ask me, because I didn't write it. but of course, Keynes didn't exclude monetary financing of government spending. I mean, he actually suggested this again before the Macmillan Committee. He said if the adverse effects are such, borrowing is such that it causes a spike in yields, well, you just apply to the Committee of Ways and Means, which was a sort of way of borrowing from the bank, really. And Hopkins said, no, that's inflation. So that's the way that debate went. But I mean, I think I would say that if the government can get its money as cheaply as it can now, then I mean you haven't got any need of monetary, Corbynomics. But on the other hand, situations may arise in which you might want to resort to them. If the expectational argument against borrowing is as strong as Nick made out, well, then you have to print money. I mean, because otherwise you're not going to get people to lend it to you.
The title of the lecture is just to promote some debate, so it's worked in that sense.
As an impartial civil servant, I would never want to discuss Corbynomics.
That's Peter, yeah.
Peter Clark. First of all, I very much welcome the allusion to the debate between Keynes and Sir Richard Hopkins. I was about to make the same point. It's not... we've seen almost a reenactment of it tonight, the greatest living authority on Keynes up against someone who embodies at least one version of the famous Treasury view. But there is an even more fundamental point that lies behind that, I think, on the way our whole discussion is structured. We're here because it's 80 years since Keynes published a book, but actually we're talking very often about policy. Now, how much do we actually need what is in the great book in order to inform us on Keynesian responses in a more pragmatic way as political economy? After all, I think Robert and I would agree on this. Keynesian economic policies can be identified going right back into the early 20s, at any rate well before the great man evolved his general theory. It would be naive to suppose that Keynesian policies simply derive from the intellectual fountainhead of the general theory. It seems to me that actually, to be a Keynesian in pragmatic policy terms, about all you need that you can actually attribute to the general theory would be a proposition like, we have conditions in which individual rationality may be divorced from the collective good, in what individuals are doing in their own economic interests may in fact prove collectively self-defeating in a way that the general theory helps us to understand. And could I follow that up with a question, again, going back to the policy debates, this time in the United States in the 1930s. I think it was Mariner Eccles, the chair of the Fed, who talked about monetary policy and introduced the great metaphor. He said it's like pushing on a piece of string. You can certainly pull on a piece of string with great effect, but can you really push on a piece of string to evoke economic recovery?
I was careful to mention credit as well as monetary policy. I think sometimes the sort of pure monetarism misses the point. The 2008-9, I think, was very different from 1929 to 32. This was far more of a pure banking crisis. And what happens when you have a severe banking crisis is the credit channels become very severely impaired. I think, certainly in terms of the British interventions, they were fairly textbook interventions designed, in one sense, pick up on your point about the conflict between individual rationality and the collective good. All government intervention in the economy is ultimately determined by a view that somehow the authorities acting in some wider interest can do the right thing. And I think my view is that those credit interventions proved very effective indeed. And I still am of the view that monetary interventions in their widest sense, focusing on credit channels can make a difference. Now there clearly are limiting cases where you are in a genuine liquidity trap, and conventional monetary measures can have no further impact. But if you look at what the Bank of England did, and led by Mervyn King under very extreme circumstances, this was an institution which, unlike Montague Norman's in the 20s and 30s, was prepared to contemplate very radical, clues in the name, unconventional monetary policies. Now, there's an interesting debate to be had about QE. Are there diminishing returns when it comes to quantitative easing? I mean, clearly the initial intervention is likely to have the biggest effect. But I remain optimistic that monetary responses can have an impact. But in the end, this again may be sort of Treasury defeatism. There are limits even to what the authorities can do. There are natural cycles, and sometimes intervening over and over and over again, I think, can cause more damage than not intervening at all. It's a difficult situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think Peter's asked a very interesting question. I mean, you're quite right. There was a lot of policy, which we now call Keynesian, before the General Theory was written. There was also a lot of policy which we don't quite recognize as Keynesian before the General Theory was written. Policy Keynes was advocating. He was a quantity theorist. I mean, and even in the treatise on money, he really believed in monetary policy. Now, he only mentioned fiscal policy because monetary policy was blocked by the gold standard. So he said, you've got to try and do something else. But he believed that if you pumped enough money into the system, enough credit, created enough money in the system, and created credit conditions of sufficient potency, you could get out of a slump. The interesting thing is, and that line in Keynes, which people don't really understand today, really comes out of Wicksell, and that type of monetary reform. I mean, Keynes was much more influenced by Wicksell than by Fisher. He abandoned that, though, in the depth of the slump. He said, if you've got into a really serious slump, then you can't, you run out of ammunition as a central bank. And so he switched more to fiscal policy. And that became the sort of, the thread really running through the general theory and monetary policy. He then developed liquidity preference theory to explain why monetary policy wouldn't work. necessarily. And I think it's still an issue today. I don't quite agree with Nick about the efficacy of monetary policy in a serious slump. I think when you have a really a period of stagnation, it doesn't seem to me that quantitative easing has very much effect, and I think that's what Draghi is finding out in Europe at the moment. And to the extent that it does have an effect, it tends to increase inequality quite substantially. And one reason is we're not very clear about the transmission mechanisms. I mean, they were, when the bank started quantitative easing in 2009, they thought that the bank lending channel was going to be the most important. It turned out not to be. Then they switched to a wealth effect, and so they didn't really know how it worked. And I don't think it has worked that well. It's had a small impact, but then very rapidly the impact dissipates. So I would still say there's a strong case for fiscal policy, despite all the objections about not having shovel-ready works, and all that, of course, was made in 1930 by Richard Hopkins and the Treasury at that time. That language is exactly the same. But so I would still say there's a case for fiscal policy. When you're in very, very serious trouble, it's probably the only thing that can get you out of it.
Good. Now, I know I've got two questions here, which I'll take, and then I think I'll do two questions there. So we're doing two batches of two, if I may, and then we'll move over there.
Thank you. Roger Bootle, Capital Economics. First of all, a quick comment, and then a question, if I may, to both panelists. The comments about the multiplier. It seems to me it's very important about what it is that you think is limiting the size of the multiplier. This connects up with the point made, I think, by Robert Skidelsky about the difference in a closed and an open economy. This is ultra important, in my view, because the world as a whole is a closed economy. And both in the 1930s and in the recent financial crisis, we had the phenomenon that a huge part of the industrialized developed world was severely depressed. So if the problem is imports, demand leaking out through imports, isn't it rather important that each country's imports actually reflect some other country's exports? This is not an argument, in other words, against a coordinated expansion. The same doesn't apply to Ricardian equivalence, in the sense that if Ricardian equivalence is right, it presumably can be right across a whole load of countries. So if that's what's limiting the size of the multiplier, then even a coordinated expansion is limited. And on that score, it seemed to me that Ricardian equivalence is over-formalized, in a sense. The idea that economic agents, so-called, either households or firms, calculate, foresee all this, it seems to me to be not right. But there's a, dare I say it, a Keynesian version of this, which seems to me to be very plausible. That's to say, you see the deficit mounting and continuing. You see the debt ratio going up. You read about this, and you just think to yourself, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's around the corner, but it doesn't seem to be very nice. It's a sense of panic and diminishing confidence. So my question is it that sort of thing, Sir Nicholas, that underlay the Treasury's anxiety? After all, given that we can borrow in our own currency and given that we can order the central bank to buy our own debt, what were you really worried about as the deficit was quite high and the debt ratio was climbing? Is it that sense of a sort of Ricardian equivalence effect? The notion that somehow or other you get a market panic, I would suspect in those circumstances, well, it's a bit far-fetched. And to Robert Skidelsky, the question is, how far was Keynes worried about this debt issue? Because as I understand it, debt in the run-up to the Second World War, although it wasn't as high as it subsequently became, it was pretty high as a result of what happened in the First World War. To what extent was he worried that the size of the debt would constrain effective action?
Give the mic behind, and we'll take that question as well, please, and then I'll go over there.
Okay, thank you. My name's Jeff Tyler. I work at the TUC. Well, I mean, it occurs to me that it seems rather early days to be making conclusions about, what's been going on recently. I don't know whether Sir Nicholas is claiming sort of vindication of the Treasury's stance, but if I look out of the window at the global economy, it doesn't seem that there's a resounding success story going on. There's been repeated financial fragility, pretty unprecedented slow growth, unprecedented falls in real wages. And even in terms of the public finances, we've ended up with debt as a share of GDP pretty much where we didn't want to end up. I mean, the Commission released some figures today showing UK debt was 90% of GDP pretty much. So it would seem to me that it's very early days to conclude that what has been done is correct. But
You vanished to silence, I mean your voice.
I did it. I'm sorry about that.
Well, the question was, is it too early for Nick to claim success, I think was the question. And also, what were you really worried about, and was Keynes worried about debt? So, do you want to kick
Nick,
off, Nick?
why don't you?
Okay, I mean, of course, it's early days. This is one reason why I really hope that this crisis regenerates economics in the universities. You know, lots of mathematical equations are important, and as Sir Nicholas Lordstone would point out, you know, actually, you know, you need to understand serious maths to be a serious economist, as Keynes was. But actually, you need to get beyond that and sort of. These are such exciting issues. I mean, there must be so many PhDs to be written about the world crisis. This is regenerated macroeconomics. So, look, I'm not claiming the Treasury's got all the answers. You know, you worked in it. You know, far from it. But I am saying that actually, I think, you know, on the whole, our interventions were reasonably sensible and have made a difference. I'll just quickly move on to Roger Bootle's points, because I think they are really interesting. What I was trying to say in my talk was not that I knew all the answers. I was trying to explain why the Treasury is a bit cautious. Now, that in an ideal world, you would have brilliant international cooperation. But ever since the Germans got their fingers burnt a bit in the 1970s, when there was an attempt to have a coordinated fiscal intervention, you know, this is a country which has persistently not played ball. And although I made the point today that I did not think Britain's recent problems were a demand problem, I think you can make a case in the Eurozone at various points that the problems in the Eurozone were partly a demand problem. I mean, look, I am not a pure Ricardian, and Lord Skidelsky made a very good point that Ricardo didn't even subscribe to pure Ricardianism. But I do think it's an issue, and you know, Britain is a very open economy, and I remember at various points in the crisis thinking, well, most of what we're doing will just benefit the Bavarian car industry. Rather than the UK. Nothing wrong with that. I'm all for Bavarians, but it didn't seem a priority. I'd just like to finish with one point which is relevant. Yes, you can make the point that at any point in time people will fund the deficit, but it is worth bearing in mind that Britain, you know, I see representatives, Sir Robert Stamen, who runs the debt management office here, say, you know, the big difference between Britain and Japan is I think 25% of our debt is held internationally, whereas a tiny percentage, like 5 or 6 or 8%, is held of Japanese debt is held internationally. And I think 2 institutions hold some 50% of Japanese debt. And I mean, look, we can always devalue, and actually Britain has often devalued itself out of any problem. I don't personally, you know, I'm not particularly proud of devaluation. I mean, your man sitting next to you has always advocated it, but you know, devaluation is a con. You know, it makes people a whole lot worse off. So that explains my scepticism.
But Greece would be much better off if it could devalue. I mean, you know, internal devaluation is much, much more difficult and more painful than you know, the other kind of con. Yes, of course, Roger, I mean, if one could have international coordination of these things, a whole segment of the world being depressed, that would be ideal, and that's exactly what someone like Keynes was proposing in 1932-33. In the means to prosperity, but then you didn't have it, and therefore what do you do? Now, I don't think, so I think this Ricardian equivalence thing is interesting. We seem to be going back to it. Of course, if you keep the quantity of money, or are able to keep the quantity of money constant, you know, the fixed money supply, then you have physical crowding out. That is one obvious thing, and therefore, and Hawtrey said that in 1925 in his paper. So, in fact, you need monetary expansion if you're to avoid that kind of thing. But then you raised the point about really it was a psychological crowding out, and that I think is very important. But when George Osborne said in his budget speech, we have to consolidate because we do not intend to go the way of Greece. Now, that was not a helpful or correct analogy to be drawn. And as a justification, it was panic-mongering. There wasn't any chance that Britain was going to go the way of Greece.
Bill Keegan is dying to get in and say something there, I think, very quickly, Bill, and then I'll come over there.
Can the man sitting next to Roger defend himself on devaluation? Now and again, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition, and Italy's problem vis-à-vis Germany is that it can't devalue. And the Bundesbank rubbed its hands when it discovered that the Italians, they didn't really like the single currency, but the fact that the Italians couldn't devalue against the Germans was good news for Germany. Look at Germany's trade surplus, something like 8% of GDP. Regarding equivalence, I think there's a paradox here that maybe if people are behaving in the way that Ricardo didn't believe, but other people believe he did, and not spending, then surely that adds the case for government spending.
Now, I've got two questions over here that I must take, and if they could be quite quick, and then I've got two more hands. If we can get them all in, we can then end up with this. So these two, then one there, and then Peter Henderson.
Hello, my name is John Thompson. I'm not an economist, and my question, if it is that, will reflect that, I think. But I come back to the term collective good, which Peter mentioned, and I'm struck that collective good seems to be unproblematically equated with the highest degree of GDP growth, GNP growth. And I'm just thinking whether this is not going to be... I'll just look in America now, where the growth has been quite good, but a lot of Americans on both sides of the political spectrum are clearly very unhappy, and unhappy for economic reasons, and whether the collective good might not be seen as including more things, including a greater degree of economic equality. And that leads me to ask the historical question of Robert, really. Did Keynes think full employment was important simply as a means for maximum production, or did he see it as a social good in itself?
Well, do you want me to answer that very quickly?
Yeah.
He thought, writing at the time of Great Depression and the interwar years when there was 10% of unemployment going on. Of course, he thought it was a incredible waste, as well as inhuman, and that you could actually do something about it if people wanted to. But I don't think he regarded that as an end in itself. I think there you have to read something like The Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. What he really wanted to do was to run the economy at full blast for a few years until you got GDP up to such an extent that people could then take out more of it in leisure. And I think that was his long-term growth perspective. But, there was this short-term problem. And you don't start that kind of road to utopia on the basis of 10 or 20% involuntary unemployment. It's as simple as that.
Thank you. Right, I've got three final hands. I think these have to be the final ones. So one in the middle there, one the gentleman in blue, and one Peter there.
Brian Butterworth. I'm not an economist. And I want to just get on briefly to Corbynomics, or something like Corbynomics. What would a Keynesian solution to the problem of increasing inequality be?
Thank you. That's one, two, and then three.
Andrew Keckwick. What would Keynes have said about the 10 years preceding and during the 2008-9 crisis?
Thank you.
What would he have said about what?
The 10 years preceding the 2008 crisis. Peter.
Can I pick up Peter Clarke's happy phrase of Keynes as intellectual fountain and link it to what you've been saying about the need for a regeneration of economics teaching? The economic history, which was amongst the queens of historical studies when I first knew Peter, has suffered in recent years. It seems to me that the restoration of economic history as part of the mainstream teaching of economics is a first-order question. And also, Keynes was a remarkably good economic historian. And the other thing that I think, this sounds unkind really coming from a historian who knows the square root of bugger all about economics, if I'm honest, is that Keynes made it sing for a wider audience. You read essays in biography for pleasure. You read his essay on Alfred Marshall, and it comes off the page. You're with Alfred Marshall. Now, the economics profession, for all its many, many virtues, is about as exciting as a recitation of the Walthamstow telephone directory for those who are no longer initiated in its funny ways. So JMK as intellectual fountain and as kindler of minds, I think, and that's why he will have this great luster, as Robert said, and I think Nick said too, on the centenary of the general theory. But it goes much wider than that one book, and he's an exemplar across the piece about, as Robert said, how to do economics.
Very good. I should say that when I referred to the economic consequences of peace, in the few months before 1920, it sold 100,000 copies in a very short time. Fantastic. Who wants to take those three questions in any order or any part of them?
Well, I'm going to pass over Corbynomics because I think it would be inappropriate as a serving civil servant. Keynes and the crisis, the crisis reflected a monumental collective intellectual error by the authorities in the leading capitalist economies. In Britain, there was a collective error, and I'm one of the guilty men, by the Bank of England, the FSA, and the Treasury. Now, it's always slightly absurd, imagine, sort of ascribing to a man of genius an ability to spot anything, spot everything. But Keynes, as I said, I think where he really was unique was, the economist who, as market practitioner, who really understood markets. And so the sort of romantic believer in Keynes in me would like to think that he would have spotted that. As for economic history, I have a sideline which is teaching a course at King's College London on the Treasury and economic history since 1945. I think economic history is really important. I really would like to see it revived in the universities. And as someone who's committed to ensuring that the Treasury writes better, I do think that as well as being able to write squiggly differential equations, it is really important that people can write succinctly and simply, and everybody would learn from reading some of Keynes's polemical pieces. They really were very well constructed indeed.
Thank you. Robert, final word.
Yeah. On distribution, he would have been a redistributor, and he had a macroeconomic argument for redistribution. It wasn't central at the time because he believed investment was the more urgent thing. But he would have said, of course, you increase the propensity to consume. It could have been, he said you could do it either way. I mean, that was part of his sort of analytical framework. Which one you did, whether you tried to increase investment at a particular time or whether you tried to increase consumption, he thought it was a matter of where you were. It wasn't an analytic point, but undoubtedly the propensity to consume had a macroeconomic function. 10 years preceding the crisis, I wonder. I mean, I think he would have got worried about the lack of regulation of the banking system. He would have been very, very worried about he was never very much in favor of the international mobility of capital, certainly not after the First World War. In fact, the system he set up really had capital controls built into it. So I think he would have been alert to the possibility of financial collapse. Incidentally, there was a huge banking collapse in the Great Depression. In fact, Keynes sort of wrote at exactly the same time as Fisher, the debt deflation problem. I mean, the articles appeared exactly, Fisher's got the credit for it, but Keynes wrote it almost at the same time. And finally, of course, he was, I entirely agree with you, Pete, about economic history. You see, and when you talked about differential equation, Keynes said two things relevant to this. He was asked by, a student came up to him and said, I'd like to do some economic history. He said, look, wait till you're in old age when your mental powers are feebler. So he thought, and the second remark relevant to this about differential equation and about maths in general, he said the most difficult thing in the world is to do arguments. And arguments actually create logical arguments and propositions which you can properly, defend and develop. And he thought that was the most difficult thing. And of course, maths is part of that. It's not essential. You can't argue logically without having formal maths. But of course, maths is very, very useful for that purpose. And to that extent, Keynes was a mathematician. But he was also a wonderful stylist. He thought maths had its place. He was influenced by Marshall. You should keep maths, a little bit to the side and not display your technical apparatus for everyone to gawp at and say how wonderful you are. I mean, he said, look, if in general theory, he did a version of the quantity theory of money. He said, for those who are interested in these kind of concoctions, I'll do it this way, but he obviously didn't regard it as central. And then the stylist, I often wonder whether style lasts longer than substance in the influence a person continues to have. I'm thinking, of A.J.P. Taylor, Alan Taylor. I mean, I think what he said is not going to be very influential in the future, but his style was really what made him. Anyway, that's just a thought.
Good. Right, well, thank you ever so much, ladies and gentlemen, for attending. Thank you for your questions from both economists and non-economists, from Keynesian and non-Keynesians. But most of all, can I thank on your behalf our two speakers, Lord Skidelsky and Sir Nicholas Macpherson, both for their introduction and their questions.
Thank you for joining us at the British Academy for the Humanities and Social Sciences for this evening's debate. If you want to find out more about the British Academy, including the details of other forthcoming events, please visit britac.ac.uk or follow @britac_news on Twitter. We hope you enjoyed this live video stream and look forward to welcoming you to future events at the British Academy.